Stop second guessing yourself, mate. Just go for it, bud.
Yeah. Yeah, you just got to go for it. Just got to go for it, you know?
Just go for it.
Sometimes I act like I know what I'm doing. Hey, guys. Here for another Tech Talk here at Reveal Group. And this time we're going to talk about the UiPath Object Repository. I'm Marty Ross, and I'm a practice lead and citizen developer enthusiast. I'm here with two of my colleagues, Simon and Tom. So Simon, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Simon Davey. I'm the APAC practice lead for UiPath at Reveal Group, and my role is basically solution architecture. Tom?
Yeah, hey guys, I'm Tom. I'm the lead developer at Reveal Group, so I'm also based in Australia, if you couldn't tell from the accent.
Yeah, so we are a global firm here, and so we like to kick some ideas around and share our ideas around the world. So we thought we'd just bring all of our heads together here on this Tech Talk. So let's get into it about the object repository. We thought it'd be a good idea to go ahead and talk to you guys about, what is the object repository? And to do that, we thought we'd start maybe with a little bit of history. And so it's been around since the release of 20.10, which was back in October of 2020. And for a lot of organizations who have been in the UiPath space, oftentimes it takes a little while for you to get around to actually upgrading your platform. And so many organizations are actually just now really getting into using this functionality, even though it's been around for 18 months. So it's a good time for us to come together and maybe share some tips and tricks that we've learned since we've been using it for the past year and a half now. So I guess a bit of context setting first. The 20.10 upgrade back in October of 2020 brought some major changes in the way that we interact with the UI elements in UiPath. And the overall kind of enhancement is called the modern design experience. And the reason that this was, something that got brought out was that historically we had a ton of flexibility in UiPath for how we interact with different UI elements. And so a good example of this is that we used to have like 4 different ways that we could interact or click with an element. And we had 5 different ways that we could extract text from an element. And it ends up being a lot to keep up with. And so UiPath recognized the need to simplify the user experience for the developer. And they actually began experimenting with a simplified activity set, and they put that in their Studio X product. And after kind of using that for about a year in the Studio X product, they officially rolled it out for wider use for all the developers on the Studio product with the 20.10 release, and again, released that under the banner of the modern design experience. And so this new set of activities in the modern design experience, it took what was previously 40 unique activities, condensed it down to 14. And this also brought us the star of today's Tech Talk, and that is the object repository. So really, what is that object repository? Well, it's a feature of the modern design experience that ensures the management, the reusability, and the reliability of all our UI elements. And what that does is it allows us to capture them in a central repository that we can then share across all of our projects. And so kind of in simple terms, the object repository gives us the concept of centralized selector management in UiPath. And there's a whole lot of information on this and the basics of how we use this and the modern design experience in general out on the UiPath Academy. And so if you haven't taken the time to go through one of those courses, definitely take the time to go through one of those courses. But this kind of brings us to the next topic, which is, why should we be using the object repository? Why is it important to us? So let's talk about maybe some real world examples. Simon, Tom, if you guys want to jump in here, what are some real world examples of why we should be using this?
Well, I suppose, Marty, probably one that's very prevalent at the moment is basically your retirement of Internet Explorer. A lot of companies out there are actually, retiring Internet Explorer, having to make the decision of whether they move their automations to Chrome or to Edge, and they're going through a lot of remediation work at the moment. And this is a perfect time to have a talk about taking advantage of what the object repository can bring to make you able to maintain a big automation program at scale in a more manageable way.
And I guess to add to that, from a developer's perspective, not just the management of an overall project, it's has the capability to simplify the day-to-day kind of development of an automation. To put it back in the context of an Internet Explorer migration, it may not be available to a lot of people because, like Marty said, a lot of people are only getting access to object projects now because they haven't upgraded. But say when the next big change happens, which it always does, being able to transfer your selectors from one application to another, say within an organization, you want to change from Chrome to Edge or Edge to Chrome or something like that. An object repository allows you to update one selector once and it would flow through the entire automation, no matter how many times you've referred to it within the code itself. So it really does simplify those kind of large scale actions.
Yeah, no, exactly. It really does. And like Tom said, there's some organizations out there that, they're just now getting into that object repository. But those that bought in early and actually started migrating some of their code onto the object repository, this transition off of Internet Explorer and onto other platforms, it really is simplifying and easing that. One thing that I've also seen is that the object repository has actually been an enabler even for citizen development to occur at scale. And so it allows you to kind of take the function of creating selector definitions, which honestly can sometimes be some of the more challenging and troublesome aspect of building an automation. And it allows you to centralize that within your core center of excellence. And then you can publish a set of common selectors and objects out there for folks to use. And it really does enable citizen development programs to scale more effectively if used correctly.
Yeah, I think probably one of the things, Marty, that I like the most about it is traditionally with the classic design experience, if we can call it that now.
Sure.
You had these little snippets of configuration spread all throughout your code base. So, if like most automation programs, eventually IT will upgrade one of the applications you're automating, and you'll have to go back and do some maintenance. Having to wade through X number of processes to find which processes have interacted with a particular screen, and then actually implement our bug fix or our enhancement, we find, in the classic design experience, you're doing that multiple times. And with some nice, clean architectural tips, which we'll get to in a minute, you can actually limit that with the object repository to only one or two places, which I think everyone's going to say is a time saver.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, speaking of some of those tips and tricks, maybe it's a good time to dive into some of those. Tom, I know you've been very hands-on with the object repository, especially. Love to hear any tips and tricks you may have.
Yeah, thanks, Marty. One of the main pitfalls that people run into when they initially begin with the object repository is they have a very developer mindset in their naming conventions when they actually build the object repository itself. UiPath have given us a very easy to use and intuitive hierarchy of elements. So you'll have an application which leads into a screen and a screen which leads into elements, and you can have elements within elements. For example, a table in each cell and range and things like that. Initially, a lot of people want to be very specific with the naming of them. For example, screen 1 might have first name, last name. Screen 2 also has first name, last name, and they'll name it first 1, last 1, first 2, last 2, something like that. We have found that it actually muddies the water a little bit. So the best approach is to have very simple, very bare bones kind of naming conventions and use the hierarchy to your advantage. So you know that first name, last name is going to be on screen 1. And essentially you want to duplicate or replicate exactly what you're seeing on the application screen.
it's kind of twofold. It's to simplify it for yourself in future reference, obviously, but also the fact that, like Marty mentioned, this really does enable citizen developers. So to keep it as simple as possible and as close to the screen that you're using as possible without any kind of reference to the current process that you're developing at that time. We found that it's much more useful and much more user-friendly to keep it as simple as possible. That's probably tip one. Tip two, which is a bit more developer-y, is that the parameterizations of your selectors is a little bit different compared to how it used to be. And people have run into issues. We've run into plenty of them when we first initially started to use the object repository. But now we've figured out a bit of a pragmatic approach to it, where with development, you want to move from dev to test to prod. And as you're doing this, obviously you're upgrading your object repositories and your activity libraries and all those things. We found that if you parameterize your object repository within the activity itself, it will actually write over itself when you do upgrade that package. So you have to parameterize the object repository selector at the object repository level. So it has an order of operations that need to be followed if you want to parameterize it out. And it makes it simpler and a little bit more complex at the same time, but it does work across the board. Whereas the other one, we've run into plenty of issues with it. So first one, I'll just start with just normal selectors. So if you have a selector, you have to go into the object repository, create an element as normal. When you create that element, you then create the variable within the selector itself. So if you may have multiple selectors for the same element, but it may have different variables. So that means that you will have to have multiple objects within your object repository that may refer to the same selector, but they're unique in the way that they deal with the variables. That obviously just will reflect itself in your development code. So you don't have to do that if you don't want to, but if you need that, that's what you have to do to avoid the pitfalls that we run into. The more difficult one is for screens and URLs more specifically. You can't actually create a screen in the same way that you create a selector and parameterize it, because it won't let you do it. Unfortunately, if you create a screen, the URL itself is in plain text. It's not in selector format, and it's not in like a UiPath string. It's just in plain text. It's got a URL. So if you add a variable in there, it won't work. It will essentially just assume that your URL contains plus variable one plus in it, as opposed to actually referring to a selector. So what you have to do is you have to, outside of the object repository, create a use application/browser activity. Make sure that it's not linked to your object repository when you do this. And then you indicate the screen like you normally would, very similar to the classic experience. So you create an activity, you then refer to it on the screen as normal. Then within the properties of the activity, that's when you can parameterize it. You can add your variables, you can add whatever you want in there. Once you're happy with that, you then click the little, it looks like a target button on the activity. You then click that and it will link to the object repository, and you'll be able to name your screen, what application it's in, and then going forward, that screen will be parameterized. So it's a little bit different, but it's the same amount of effort. It's just, if you know how to do it, it's very simple. So they're probably the biggest tips and tricks.
Great tips. Yeah, it seems like that order of operations is really important with the object repository. Imagine there's a fair bit of learning from experience on that.
I suppose, yes, Marty, the last thing you want to do is upgrade your process to reference a new object repository that someone's built, and then find that it's permanently pointing at the development environment because the URL's hard-coded.
So that probably brings us to the next section here, and that's now that we have some tips and tricks, how do we think about actually architecting a solution that incorporates the object repository? And Simon, maybe you could tackle that.
Sure. So I suppose when we talk about architecture, before I put everyone to sleep, because everyone loves these sorts of conversations and diagrams, we've got to look at what we're trying to achieve. So The aim behind using an object repository is to give us really good flexibility for reuse, to enable us to decouple elements of our code so that we can manage it in one place and then allow it to be consumed everywhere. And at the same time, we're trying to do all this by minimizing the maintenance overhead so that when we do have IT drop a new version of an application we need to automate, it's quick and easy to incorporate those changes and get our automations back into production, driving business benefit. So with those sorts of thoughts in mind, there's obviously probably, without going into humongous circular conversations around all the possible permutations that are out there, because there's never the one-all architecture that is correct. It's based upon your organization's environment and challenges and the drivers behind your program. You'll choose an architecture that fits. But let's sum it up in three basic forms. I have processes directly connected to an object repository. I have processes that maybe consume a library that contains an object repository. And then we can go right down the other end where I have an object repository as its own library that may be consumed by activity libraries. And then those activity libraries might be consumed by processes. So it's a bit like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. You've got to find the one that's just right. In our experience, when we first started using the object repository, we really started off way down at the basic end of the scale. Let's build an object repository pretty much targeted for our citizen developers and get them to build processes directly off it. Now, one of the interesting things we found with this architecture was we all know that having a selector is fantastic, but it's the combination of the selector with the activity properties that gives us the capability we're looking for in our code. So what we found with that was it was fantastic to be able to centralize all our selectors, but we found when we had to actually fix bugs, it was a combination of the selector plus activity properties that had to change. So we found with that architecture that we got a marginal benefit increase over the maintenance side of things, but we still found we had to go through multiple processes to actually incorporate the fixes. So if we sort of put that architecture in the pillar of, we get some flexibility, but maintenance wasn't driven down a huge degree. So, probably not the best one if you've got a large number of processes. If I come right out to the other end of the scale, where we actually really decoupled our code and said everything was its own library and it had a reference to the next one, etc., we found that had fantastic flexibility. We could consume and use in all the various ways we wanted to without too much problem. What we found in that architecture, though, was that the maintenance didn't really decrease. And the main reason for that was, again, the selector plus the activity properties drives the capability we're looking for. And so if we needed to make a minor change once we got into testing, we'd have to go back, update our object repository and republish a library. Then we'd have to come to our libraries and reference that object repository, make the minor change on the activity we were working on, test it, make sure we were happy, publish that library as a new version. Then we'd have to come down to our processes and update the references in our processes. And we found that on a project where, as you're going through your test cycle, you find lots of these little, test is working slightly different to prod or slightly different to dev. I need to make a few minor tweaks here and there. The maintenance overhead increased a great deal. And our development teams certainly let us know in their feedback. So what we've found is to take a very pragmatic approach and to moderately decouple. So what we recommend is typically you want to have a library of activities that automates an application. And so we found the best way was to actually put the object repository plus your custom activities in a single library. That way, that library can be built in isolation if need be. Could be built by your center of excellence and then handed out for everyone to use for consumption. The objects and the activities are very close in the same project, so therefore if you need to make minor changes and retest, you're only sort of editing in one project, you're keeping it sort of local. The benefit of using a library is if you're taking advantage of UiPath's testing capabilities, which we might cover in a future tech talk, you can actually build automated regression tests across your entire library. So make a change, quickly assess that you've not broken anything, republish, send it out for consumption. So we found that we got the best benefits with a reasonable maintenance overhead by keeping our decoupling relatively simple, not going over the top, not getting excited by the what ifs, just keeping it pragmatic.
Really good suggestion there in terms of how to practically apply the object repository to our automations. And did I just hear you hint at future UiPath Tech Talk there, Simon?
Absolutely, absolutely. Big advocate for automated testing. And I think the new capabilities that you can take advantage of, especially if you're using the Studio Pro licensed edition, you can certainly get some awesome automated test capability that really makes, especially if you're building reusable componentry, really makes the ability to make minor code changes with confidence and reduce the effort to then get them published for consumption.
Well, I think that about does it for our time here. Simon, Tom, thanks for jumping on with me. Hopefully you guys got a lot of useful information out of this tech talk on the object repository. Thanks. How do I turn this off?